Hi everybody, this is John Costa in the UK, and I've been joined by Dodge Billingsley over there in Salt Lake City in America. It's great to see you, Dodge. How are you keeping? You okay?
Good. You know, it's cold. It's winter, but you know, it's to be expected.
Excellent. Well, listen, thanks for taking the time to speak to us. I just want to do a bit of a bio, actually, because normally we dive straight into it, and I just assume that everybody knows who you are. So it always goes into the blog post or at the end of the in the YouTube bio. So I wanted to do this. So you're a director of the Combat Films and Research, which is an independent media company, and it's been good to do things with you over many years now. You're the editor and the contributor to the US Army's OE Watch, which we can talk a little bit about, hopefully, which is a monthly online publication. And I remember the launch of Fangs of the Lone Wolf, Chechen Tactics in the Russian-Chechen Wars, 1994 to 2009. So again, I'm sure we'll touch on that as well, the tactics which are relevant to our conversation about Ukraine. And that was published in Ukraine, actually, by Astrolabe Publishing as well. You're a frequent lecturer. Going to be published, okay. And you're a frequent lecturer and former fellow of the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies at Brigham Young University. And again, you know, documentaries that you've made for those are actually the Border series are actually in our documentary media center here in Leicester, archived in the Conflict Memory and Education Project. So listen, I'm delighted to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time. It's been a while since we spoke, but the whole situation in Ukraine just seemed to be too good an opportunity to catch up with you, particularly with the fact that you're hoping to go and visit very soon. So just tell us a little bit about what your take is on the situation.
Well, I mean, on one level, I could say we've seen this coming for a long time. I wouldn't say as far back as the Russian-Chechen Wars, but I definitely would say as far back as 2008 in the Russia-Georgian War. On the other hand, you kind of want to assume that it'll never get to this, but it looks like it has, right? To the point of conflict, the U.S. announced they're moving troops to Poland and Romania this morning, of course. I know different European countries are pre-positioning troops and moving men and equipment here and there. I don't think any, of course, are intended to go into Ukraine, but yeah, we're kind of at a flashpoint.
Yeah, it's an interesting take. I mean, you know, when I was in the army a long time ago, it was all Cold War related, sort of 85 to 90. And everything was about going to Germany and stuff. And my son's in the army now, and you know, Germany is not really a thing. You know, they brought all the troops home. We've made a really big deal about, you know, rejuvenating barracks here, bringing whole units and regiments home, and now we're talking about going back. So I'm not sure if Putin's aim was to weaken NATO, as if he's not seemed to have galvanized them into probably a little bit more of a cohesiveness that we've not seen with the UK and NATO for a long time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It's interesting. I was talking to a colleague the other day, and he says, you know, this is sort of like, for those of us old enough to have grown up in the Cold War, remember that. This is almost like that battle in the Fulda Gap, you know, the Russian, you know, massive tank battles, the potential to have massive armored battles. You know, of course, you have air assets and the new elements like drone swarms that were tested very well in the Azerbaijani conflict and in Syria. But it could be this sort of massive, you think of the old tank battles, World War II, like Kursk and some of the others. I still can't believe that would happen, but you're in a position where if it's going to happen anywhere, it can happen here in the Ukraine. And it is interesting how it sort of galvanized, or you see this, I don't know, you know, galvanized is an interesting word. Maybe it has in many respects. Then you also see sort of splits and divisions amongst a lot of the NATO members. Each country still has to sort of figure that out for themselves. It certainly seems like the countries that border Ukraine, like Romania and Poland, obviously feel like they have more at stake or more to lose, or they seem to be more willing to sort of support against Russia than maybe some of the Western European allies or in the NATO pact. But it is interesting to see everybody kind of come around. And I wonder if that's, if it'll be a galvanizing moment or, you know, or not. I don't know.
Yeah, I think, you know, I mean, for many years we've seen, you know, the Russians as a kind of non-combative threat, if you like, and more of a threat through spies, and kind of back to those days of the Cold War. Obviously, we've had the various poisonings that we had here in Salisbury, various assassination attempts on dissidents. There's a lot of Russian money in London as well, with oligarchs and stuff. And then you've got European countries that are starting to get quite dependent on pipelines and gas and things like that. So I guess it's not straightforward when it comes to two people with big sticks having a conflict anymore. It's more about now there's all these, it's the commercial aspects that get considered when it comes to, will I send troops? I mean, certainly seen that in Germany now with a new chancellor. It's the new guard now. How are they going to move forward? I mean, from your perspective, how do you think the reaction of the states would have been different before last year's kind of withdrawal from Afghanistan and the kind of impact that had on the American psyche, if you like, the American public psyche? How different would the reaction have been now if this was this time last year?
Well, if it was this time last year, it would have been different, I'm sure. But I still think there's a war weariness here in the United States. We've been at war for 20 years in Afghanistan. We had operations in Syria, of course, and so it's really hard. And then there's threats from China over Taiwan that the U.S. is, committed to, to be involved in. And so I feel like there's a general, I don't know if there's a general consensus, but that's the wrong word. But yeah, there's a war weariness, obviously, in the States. At the same time, it's interesting to see the number of volunteers from different places show up in Ukraine. We're not talking thousands, but we're talking hundreds. And that's been kind of interesting. So despite the war weariness, there is a fair amount, small numbers at least, that are willing to go over there and sort of risk it. I don't know. I think that Biden's in a tough spot, frankly. Nobody wants to go to another war right now. I know he does not want to. But do you succumb to Russian pressure? Do you let Russia take Ukraine? What do you do? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a tough one.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? And I read a book recently as well. Which obviously I'm proud of, reading a book, and at our age, the fact that we can concentrate long enough. It's the fact that we can concentrate long enough to read a book, I think we should both be proud about. But it was talking about geography and borders, and the role that geography plays in places around the world. Tibet is like, the water tower for China. And it was just talking about that kind of stuff. Kashmir. It was really fascinating. But of course, it mentioned Russia and Ukraine in particular. And this was written 2 or 3 years ago now. And it was talking about, if you understand your geography and you understand your history, and the two often meet, then you've got to understand that for Putin, Ukraine is a red line when it comes to, potential NATO membership. Once you've taken Crimea, it was a natural. Where does he go after there? Where else does he go? Well, probably doesn't need to go anywhere as far as he's concerned. He's kind of closed the door. So I think there's a lot of power politics and playing to the media by both sides at the moment.
Yeah.
And then somewhere in between, depending what news channel you're looking at, and probably not the ones that are good at spreading that patriotic kind of, let's get them type stuff. The ones that are kind of on the ground, it turns around and says, well, people in Ukraine are like, well, we've lived with this, it's no different. And then people in Russia are like, well, we don't want war either. And you talk to people in the UK and they were like, well, we don't really understand, a bit like we didn't really understand Kosovo and Bosnia and that kind of stuff. I think it's a really interesting one because it could just play out. I mean, it's got to the point now where something has to give.
Yeah.
So, there's got to be a movement one way or the other.
Yeah. I mean, we're kind of in this moment of brinkmanship, and that you never, I don't know, it's just like political science 101 back in college, when you take it that far to this point of brinkmanship, you're in trouble. I mean, you've already gone down the road far enough way that war is a real possibility now. But again, going back to my initial statement, having seen this coming, I mean, it wasn't popular among my friends from the Republic of Georgia or even my friends in Ukraine. But I mean, for the last couple of decades, and I was in Ukraine a lot in 2001, 2000 to 2004, and then kind of had to, got really busy in Afghanistan and Iraq, of course. But, most of the people want to be in NATO. And I just said, this is a really, really bad idea. And I wasn't the only one. It's just, I think whether we like it or not, there's spheres of influences. And on one level, I totally see Putin's position. He goes, because the way the NATO charter is written, U.S. troops could pull right up to the border with Russia. That's just part of the deal. If that's part of the NATO structure. So we have to look back, I think, or think of it this way: would we allow Russian troops on the Canadian or Mexico border? And of course we would not. Of course we would not. So my argument was in 2006, 7, 8, and earlier was we need to think of some sort of new paradigm to provide some sort of defense to some of these countries that want to be democratic. I get that, but the sort of NATO structure is certainly a direct threat to Russia, and he's using that he's using that in a very good way. I mean, he's already prepared the population in Russia for this for a long time. He's been talking about this in 2014, like, hey, we're being encircled. But he's, of course, encircling Ukraine. But, they can look at it and they can say, oh, wow, we're going to have NATO on Ukraine. We're going to have NATO in Georgia. We're going to have, of course, that is kind of encirclement. So again, it doesn't minimize these countries' desire to be free from such a strong role the Kremlin takes in their sphere of influence, but it is a sphere of influence. And so it makes it a bit tricky because he has a point and he can mobilize and rally his own base based on that point. And so it's totally legit. So, yeah, I don't know where this is going, but I just remember arguing about, the membership action plan map. I think Georgia was, when they went into map, I can't even remember how long ago that was, but, the sort of stepping stone to get full NATO membership. I'm like, this is not a good idea. And, I think Putin sent the message in 2008 when he crossed the border, again, on the heels of a major military exercise in the North Caucasus. And then there they were. And I thought it was also really interesting because you try to read the tea leaves and say, do you learn anything from these wars? And there's, you can look at Chechnya, of course, the 2 wars in Chechnya, and you can look at Georgia. And I thought it was really interesting that Russian troops, went down past Kinvali and on the road junction there at Gori, the birthplace of Stalin. And then they took that left turn toward the capital, Tbilisi, and then they just stopped. And that was speaking to my Georgian friends, a harrowing moment there because they didn't have to stop right there. They could have seized the capital of Georgia probably within the next few hours. So how far does this go? I mean, what is the plan here if there is an event? And I think that's what a lot of the media has been focused on is like, what does Russia do? How far do they go? They're looking at a total encirclement. They're certainly putting troops everywhere around the borders. At least if they're not going to attack or encircle, like Ukraine in full, they tie up Ukrainian troops at lots of different places where, Ukraine being a much smaller army with much less resources than Russia, they can't afford to lock troops up north of Kiev. They can't afford to lock troops up on the border near Brest. But now Russia has troops there. So if you don't, does Russia streak down across the Polish, on that Polish line there? And that'd be the line of supply from NATO. So there's all kinds of, it's all kinds of jockeying a position. I'm not sure where it leads.
Well, of course, you've got the situation there as well, haven't you? You've got like the encirclement of the Russian troops and the sort of the deployment of the Ukrainian troops. Well, in fact, the conflict is more likely to start with something which our media has been quite full of, which is sort of, the citizenry rising up to resist the invader. So we've had lots of scenes of civilians and school teachers and stuff like that, being trained to fight, sort of like guerrilla type tactics, if you like. Right. And then, of course, you've got the whole senorio playing out at the moment in Mali very successfully with Wagner Group, with this sort of, the mercenary element in inverted commas, troops that aren't part of the Russian military and aren't necessarily endorsed by them, but seem to work with their blessing.
Seem to have full access to all
underpinning stuff, underpinning stuff, destabilizing.
I just saw a report that elements of Wagner Group are leaving Mali to head to Ukraine or up, along the Ukraine border. I don't know how accurate that is, but that's interesting. Again, it's a chess game for Putin. He doesn't have to use them, but I think that means something to a lot of watchers. I think the whole idea of like a guerrilla war, partisan war. I mean, man, that area is full of it. I mean, it's what they did to the Germans and during the Second World War, the Great Patriotic Wars, they call it. Of course, we watched 2 wars in Chechnya, where it was basically a Russian military against, ramshackle Chechen volunteer base group that was a few thousand at best at any given time. And, of course, Russia won eventually, but it wasn't like they didn't bleed them. And so then I think there's this belief that now Ukraine's a lot bigger than Chechnya, of course. We have that partisan sort of history to us. that, yeah, we can maybe defend in a successful sort of rear guard guerrilla action should there be a Russian occupation. And that would be, well, from an analyst's perspective, really interesting to look at. I don't, it'd be really interesting to see how that plays out. But
I guess a conflict like that as well plays out, when it becomes a long game in the media. It's all well and good until the bodies start arriving home. And, that's on any side, isn't it? When the public's not on board, isn't it?
That would be, well, you mean if they can bloody Russia enough to but the thing is, I think the Putin regime, they don't care about that. I think they prepared the information battle space. They prepared the information space. And Russia has a long, long history of suffering. And so the body bags could come home if it came to that. And I think it would take an awful lot to turn public opinion in Russia to a point where that would factor into Putin's calculation, and he has to give back something, because he's already said, hey, they're encircling us. They want to be in NATO. We're not allowing that. And they don't want just Ukraine. I mean, he said it multiple times. He belongs to the old days, the glory days of the Soviet Union. I mean, so that includes Warsaw Pact countries, which is why probably the Baltics and Romania and Poland, they're so up in arms about this, because it's not like next week, but in their mind, their strategic thinking is, we're next. If Russia takes Ukraine, then we have Russian forces on the border with Poland, with Romania, with Slovakia, So it's like everyone's worried about being, their enemies on the border, but that's the case in every single scenario. Poles don't want Russian troops there. The Russians don't want U.S., British, German troops on their borders. And poor Ukraine is just in a very geostrategically important position.
I mean, one final thing I want to talk to you about as well is I read an article the other day. Again, I'm reading, mate. When I'm not talking to you, I'm reading non-stop. Are you proud of me? You know what I mean? Are you proud of me?
Not watching a lot of TV, reading. Good job.
Can I have a combat films and research certificate to say that I can read? It was talking about...
That's the problem. We do visual media, right? We like to make documentaries. I almost feel like it's part of my job to watch TV. Of course, not necessarily the thing that I may be watching on TV, but, to watch documentaries, to see what other people are producing, in addition to articles we read and stuff. But
absolutely, research. It's all research.
All research. That's right.
And it was talking about how Russia has started to make those noises around Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua as a way of sort of being in the backyard, kind of, as you said, nibbling at the borders, a little bit like NATO is now doing at Russia. Do you think that will be one of those games that plays out as well over the next couple of years, where it's about supporting those regimes to kind of almost be like the perceived irritant towards the American southern flank?
I do think totalitarianism is on the rise. I think the numbers show that. We had recently had elections. I think it was Nicaragua, right? And they actually then, the new president-elect ended relations with Taiwan and recognized the People's Republic of China, tilting now the balance of sort of power in that respect. Like China PRC is recognized by enough Central American states now, that you see that there are these blocks, and they may not all be in the same place, but it does really feel like the world is sort of blocking together again, and sort of a free zone block and poverty a totalitarian block. And they don't have maybe the same communist ideology, but the totalitarian idea is sort of on the rise. I mean, I do think you could almost even lump in some of the populist movements, in places like Hungary, Brazil. People would argue in America that's super rife for a contentious issue with our last president, is democracy being exposed? Is it stronger now? Is it under threat? That's the conversation that we're having here. And so I do think that there's these different blocks forming, and I think Russia will certainly have its hand in Venezuela and Nicaragua and different places. I think there's always been this idea of limits, where you can go. So even though we don't agree or we don't recognize spheres of influence officially, the U.S. government, I do always feel like there's been a natural restraint. I mean, we believe in democracy. The country believes in democracy. I personally, of course, believe in democracy, but I do feel there's been restraint. So in other words, we haven't just gone just all in Georgia, Azerbaijan, all these countries like this that border Russia. But it's in our interest for them to be democratic, because we believe in that value system. We believe people want it. And that runs head to head with some of these totalitarian or authoritarian regimes that are, I think, getting stronger. And conversation, are we getting to a new Cold War? Maybe. Is it going to lead to some hot wars like Ukraine? Is this really going to happen? Is this really happening? And that's like the $1 million question, at least for the next few months, it seems like. But it's really like we're at that brink. I don't know, because the things we're doing, like even sending troops into Poland and Romania, again, Putin used that in his base to say, yep, here they come, you know what I mean? And at the same time, he's encircling. You see us as we're encircling. My Russian friends agreed, hey, you guys are encircling us. You know, it's the perspectives here are just broad, and I don't know, it's hard to see how you come together and diffuse it. But
yeah, and I guess each move as well can be interpreted by by either side in its own way on it as well to reinforce its message.
Yeah, it always is. And so then, you know, and then you see, you know, like Poland and those guys, I mean, they're totally in the defensive, you know, sort of gap there, and they want to, I don't know, I lost my train of thought on that, but you know where I'm going, that Polish comment. But it's like, yeah, I mean, the big powers, the regional powers, the states around there, they all have their own interests as well. And I just saw that potash was like not traveling by train now into Lithuania. So I mean, already economic, you know, issues are taking place between the sort of Kremlin bloc, you know, if you include Belarus. Yeah, it's hard to see the end on this. But difficult cases have been diffused over time, and so we hope this will be diffused as well. It's hard to see.
I thought it was interesting as well in the media the other day when they were saying about some of the sanctions. I think it was by the states. I don't know if it included Britain too. I didn't get to that point. But it was just saying about individuals as opposed to the country being sanctioned. And I thought that was really interesting about sort of, you know, starting to target people in business and stuff like that. That kind of the disruption of the people, I guess, who make some of the money as well. So, you know, you start upsetting those people, they'll start saying, well, actually, you're not getting your kickback because it's affecting me. So
I've never been, you know, for short term, I don't know how effective sanctions will be. I don't know. Again, they have a long history of suffering, you know, at the hands of the Mongols, at the hands of, you know, the Germans, you know, so they've been through this before. So they can weather the storm, in my opinion. They can weather the storm. I don't know. So I don't know if these sanctions are, and plus sanctions are a long-term, you know, medium long-term strategy. So how effective will they be right now in February or March? I mean, the rumors are flying around like, you know, Ukraine's going to attack on the 14th. They're going to attack on the 20th. As soon as the Olympics are over. President Xi asked Putin to wait till the Olympics. All these rumors are out there. Maybe some of them are true. Maybe they're all elements of them are true. Elements of each one of these rumors are true. Or maybe they're completely false. It's really, really, really hard to know. But the fact of the matter is a lot of troops on those borders. It's pushed Ukraine to start to think about its overall borders, I think. I mean, I think they always did, but of course the war, you know, sort of the military zones on the east where they were directly threatened and had incursions, of course, the last 6 years. But, you know, now they have to look at all of this thing. It's going to be interesting.
Nate, it's been 3 or 4, you spent 3 or 4 trips you went to Ukraine back in 2001 to 2004.
Yeah, I was.
What are you expecting to find different when you go this time, do you think? Well,
and if we make this trip, when we were over there early on, the early 2000s, I was looking for members. Well, interestingly, and this idea of partisan warfare and volunteering is fascinating to me, and that's where I think I want to pursue and probably write on, is that in Abkhazia in 1992-93, in that conflict, Ukrainians came onto the side of Georgia simply to fight the Russians. And in Chechnya in 1994-95, Ukrainians came to Chechnya to fight the Russians. And there's photographs, you know, most of them came from Lviv, the Western Ukrainian area, but there were some from Kiev, and there's cemeteries there that you can go and look at the headstones. And they died in the war in Chechnya. They died in the war in Abkhazia. They were volunteers. And they saw this sort of mission against the Kremlin, right? You know, against Moscow's heavy hand in the region. That's fascinating to me. And there's a lot of that going around right now again. So you have Georgian units repaying the favor. You have independent Chechen units, you know, repaying the favor or just wanting to spill Russian blood. I don't know, you know, whatever. But, you know, these elements are now showing up in this conflict. And on one hand, it shows you sort of, there's a solidarity amongst lots of different people that they don't really want to be governed by Moscow. But is it enough to turn the tide? No. But it does show sort of populism or populist support across the region and even wider. But that's a fascinating story to me. Can it have any real impact? I don't know. The biggest problem with these volunteer units, like when I was in Chechnya, the funny thing was that I have my battalion. Well, how many people were in your battalion today? Oh, like 25. Half of them went home. I'm like, oh, so you only have 50? He goes, no, like 2 weeks ago we had 200. And so these sort of volunteer, they kind of come and go as they want. It's hard to put. That was one of the big complaints I heard from Chechen commanders was, knowing they're going to have the full complement of soldiers or volunteers to carry out an operation or to carry out a mission to defend against the mission or defend against a Russian, advance or something. It was just very, very ad hoc. Sometimes that's great, but a lot of times it's not that great. It gets really, really tough. Do ad hoc players turn and leave, or do they stay and suck it, and suck it up? I don't know.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because I kind of wear two hats with that one. As someone who's been a soldier in the past, I can understand that when you do section battle drills and things like that, that's because you need a section of men, so there's a certain number in order to achieve a certain objective. But we've had many conversations about conflict reportage before, haven't we? Sort of war reporting and stuff. And if you were to offhand say that you were part of a battalion, then a journalist or someone in that kind of conflict zone reporting is more likely to report that that's 600 men, as in what they know a battalion size to be, and that you're talking about 25 people. I guess that's that kind of fog of war as well, isn't it? Is one of those things that happens. We talk about unit names, but we don't necessarily accurately know how many people are actually there doing those. Actually.
No, and it's been fascinating. Like the Ukrainian announcements of being calling up different individuals, different age demographics. Females now I think are being called up and given firearms training. I saw a news report on it, so I assume it's true. I don't know how many
that plays out all the time on our media here. That's what we're focusing on: the Ukrainian people rising up to defend themselves. We don't very often talk about the Ukrainian forces themselves. We talk about the citizens being threatened. So
yeah, well, and it's true. Well, and it's interesting you bring that up because the Ukrainian chief of staff or the defense minister or both, just like late December, were like, we know we can't last. They basically said it. They did say it. We can't last very long against Russia, so we'll depend, on turning it into like a guerrilla battlefield with all of our citizenry. And this kind of acknowledgement, like, the best we can hope to hold out is 2 or 3 weeks. It's kind of like, so. I mean, I think no matter how it plays out, if the citizenry is that dedicated, then it really could be a thorn in the side of Russia because they'll take the initial objectives fairly quickly, but maybe not. I mean, and again, it's so hard to draw conclusions, and I always hesitate. Like I can say, okay, it took them like 3.5 months to take Grozny in 1994, 1995. It took them 6 weeks to take Grozny in 1999, 2000. That that December, January period. So the Russian army was certainly better in 1999 than it was in 1994, and it still took them 6 weeks to take little old Grozny. The Russian army is miles ahead of where it was in 1999. I mean, it's a completely different army. There's pride in the military. I saw a report, and I don't know if it's 100% accurate, but they said like 65% of Russian contract soldiers have combat experience. Where'd they get it? Obviously Syria, some in sub-Saharan Africa. Different places, but they've got combat experience. Over 90% of their combat aviation pilots have had combat experience. Again, probably more in Syria than any place else, but it's a tested army. And they're, it could be big if it needs to be big. And so it would be really, again, from the analyst hat, I don't want this to happen, but from the analyst position, it's like, wow, it'd be really interesting to see a partisan warfare against this modern Russian army. Like, how does this really work? Is Kharkov taken very quickly? It's close to the east and the second largest city in the Ukraine, I think. I could be wrong. I think it's the second largest city, but I'm not sure. Do they go for Kiev? Do they, knockout punch to take the government out? Do we have a massive refugee exodus through Poland, Romania, and those borders there? And I haven't heard any talk about that, but you have to assume that for every citizen who's ready to pick up a gun, there's probably 5 that don't want to. it's just not everybody's nature to do that. They'd probably rather leave. So, I mean, that's the reason alone for Poland and Germany not to want to have this go off, because the refugees probably the refugees flowing across the border
will head there, won't they? They will head there. Yeah.
I think it'd be substantial. So,
as always, Dodge, fascinating.
No answers, just a lot of discussion.
Listen, mate, we always live in interesting times. That's the approach, isn't it? So, you've got to have these conversations. You've made me think about a few things quite differently from what I've been looking at. So, from my perspective, I selfishly like interviewing you and talking to you because it gives me stuff to go away and think about and stuff. So hopefully you find it useful to empty your head.
Well, no, thanks for the opportunity. It's always fun to reconnect and talk about some of these global issues. So I appreciate it. Thanks, John.
Well, if you get out to Ukraine, maybe we can catch up with you while you're there, and definitely safe travels, and we'll catch up with you on your return.
You got it. Thank you, John.